Tonight, the scenes from two tragedies at two different schools in Minnesota and Virginia. Images showing first responders taking an alleged active shooter into custody after killing two campus police officers at Bridgewater College in Virginia. The officers were close friends, known by many as the dynamic duo. And because of their heroic efforts, no one else was injured, including a student I spoke with just moments ago. The campus was on lockdown for hours, and it was a very scary day. The other shooting in Minnesota just minutes ago, authorities arrested two people in connection to that shooting outside of a suburban Minneapolis school. One of those students shot today did not survive. The other is in critical condition tonight. These images, these stories, time and time again, are terrifying. It's a scary reality for students, for parents, for teachers, faculty, for all of us. Dr. James Densley with the Violence Project studies the patterns of mass shootings, and he is joining us live tonight. Dr. Densley, are schools soft targets?
Thanks for having me back on the show. No, not really. Schools and colleges are just a focal point in the lives of young American children, young people in general. And at the moment, they're caught in the crossfire of rising gun violence in general. I think it's easy to say that all this could be avoided if we just fortified our campuses a little bit more, turned our schools into sort of quasi-prisons. But at what cost to the students' mental health and well-being? I would say the unifying truth of all these tragedies is not that we don't do enough lockdown drills, or it's not that we don't have enough campus security. The one thing they have in common is easy availability and accessibility of guns.
Well, the other thing that you talk about in your research, you critically look at understanding, processing, and preventing mass casualty gun violence. I mean, access to guns is one thing, but I'm all ears at how we address more than just that, what some claim is the root cause of this. There's more going on, right? Mental health is an issue, how we're addressing that. What else are you seeing in your studies?
Yeah, it's a great point. So in our book, it's called The Violence Project, How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic. We have this detailed look at school mass shootings, and this includes interviews with perpetrators, school personnel, family members, survivors. So we focus on the commonalities among school shooters and the fact that they tend to be school children. They're insiders of the school. And so that has implications for school shooting prevention, because these are people who are right there in front of us every day. We've also been working really closely with the K-12 school shooting database, and that documents every time a gun is fired on a school property, and it tracks shooting trends and the threat landscape in general. We've seen a marked rise in threats of gun violence and shootings themselves in this academic year. That is tied in part to the accessibility of firearms, but it's also tied to a lot of the stresses of the past few years, the pandemic, the economic costs of the pandemic, the way that's had an impact on student mental health. It's all bubbling up to the surface, and we have this sort of perfect storm right now, which is what's feeding into the situations that we're talking about here this evening.
Well, and motivation is something that gets thrown around a lot. A lot of times we don't have any idea what the motivation is behind some of these tragic events. But does knowing why people carry out these horrific tragedies help us prevent future ones? I mean, where does that stand in all of this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of our key messages, is that you can only prevent something once you understand it. And I think, for example, recognizing that school shooters tend to be children enrolled in a school. They're walking through the doors, past the security cards every day. And well, that would make us question some of the traditional sort of target hardening approaches to school safety, because they're designed to keep the bad guys out. So you then have to kind of reassess that type of logic and think, well, if we need to be more sort of attendant to the fact that what's going on in the lives of the young people who are right there in front of us. One of the big findings from our research on school mass shooters was that they tended to be suicidal, and that their shootings were intended to be a final act. And so if we implemented more sort of suicide prevention techniques within our interventions, that could have a massive impact also on school safety, preventing homicides as well.
Does social media play a role in all of this? Has that contributed to what we're seeing? What does your data show?
Yes. So social media, we see the status rewards, the likes, the views on social media, that can incentivize the performance of violence. It can also do a lot of damage to people's sense of self, and that pushes them to commit violence in the first place. We also see people radicalized toward violence on social media. And in other research I've conducted on gangs and youth violence, we find that conflicts play out on social media. They spill out into the schools and into our streets. At the same time, you've got to track the threats of violence, and that's difficult for schools. When you see threats on social media, schools don't always necessarily know what to do with them. But we need to make sure that if people see something, they say something, because we can divert people when they see those warning signs, because often it is a cry for help and it's an opportunity for intervention and for prevention.
So many components that are important and key in trying to prevent future tragedies. James, we always appreciate you coming on and talking to us and providing a little bit of what you've learned through all of this. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.